And I'm amazed at the miseducation of people in West Virginia history. We talk about West Virginia succeeded from the Virginia Commonwealth over the issue of slavery. That simply is not true. West Virginia succeeded against the Virginia Commonwealth over economic reasons and political reasons because they didn't feel like they were being treated fairly in Richmond, the capital. They did not have equal representation, they felt, in the Virginia Commonwealth legislature, and they felt that maybe the North might win, and we want to be on the winning side. So the deal that was cut, you come into the state as a border state, like Kentucky, like Maryland, you get to keep your slaves, but eventually you're going to have to free them. That was the deal. So that was the deal that was accepted. So West Virginia comes in as a slave-holding state as the other border states. So then after the Civil War ended, most blacks, like I said, they left, got up out of here. The West Side then developed really into sort of a industrial little community because of this river. This is like the Nile River, right? Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Charleston, the Kanawha Valley is the gift of the Kanawha River because of this major shipping lane to get to the Mississippi and Ohio and move goods up and down the river. This is before automobile, before trucks and transportation. So rail and water were the way you ship large quantities of goods. It was Crete. Then, of course, there was building the transatlantic railway, and so the railroad then comes through West Virginia. So now West Virginia becomes a major thoroughfare for goods, products, and services to move. And that's kind of how Charleston was born. So then the West Side, it develops more as a residential neighborhood, rigidly segregated on the west side of Charleston. Deeds and covenants restricting where black people could live. The West Side has 7 census tracts, and I'll get this information to you through Dr. Andrich, where you can see these census tracts. And these census tracts really divide the West Side into really the 7 distinctly separate neighborhoods, actually. And greatly segregated back then, and still segregated to a great degree. Now not by the force of law, but by the force of historical housing patterns that determines where people live and in what close proximity they live. Am I making sense? That's the case of the West Side. To show you how segregated the West Side of Charleston was, I'm not from the West Side of Charleston. I'm from a little small rural community, Mount Hope, West Virginia, between Oak Hill and Beckley, at the end of the world. It was not the end, but you can see the end of the world from there. And so Charleston was a city to me. I mean, when I came here for the first time as a boy, and then when I moved here as a young man in 1978. But I could see that this place is interesting, right? It's not a whole lot different from my little neighborhood community. We were segregated at Mount Hope Elementary School. I started the school in 1962, segregated. That was 8 years after Bourne was the Board of Education, and didn't go to school with Caucasian children until I got in junior high school. And I could see the segregation pattern here in Charleston at the time myself. I lived here for 30 years, and I never heard anybody in Charleston talk about the West Side being established as 5 distinct slave plantations. Never heard anybody talk about it. It wasn't until a group of scholars, Dr. Eric Lassiter, I think he may have since left Marshall University. He was here for a number of years. And Dr. Billy Joe Payton and a couple of their colleagues, they did all this archaeological research and discovery, and they came with this project called the Glenwood Project. You Google it sometime, incredible document, the Glenwood Project, a window to the West Side. And they delved into the history and brought all this history to the surface about how the West Side was established. This is important because you won't understand where we are now until you understand where we were. And they brought it through slavery, through the time of the industrial development, residential development, and so forth. So I live on 3rd Avenue. I can't throw a rock from here, but I could probably be at my house in less than 5 minutes walking, and just walking leisurely. If you go down 3rd Avenue, straight down 3rd Avenue, right there where the Taco Bell is, and where the Pizza and all that, walk straight down 3rd. 3rd will intersect with Florida, right where Mercy Snow West Side Elementary is. You go across Florida Street, and for some reason, there's no 3rd Avenue. it becomes Hunt Avenue when you cross Florida. It never made any sense to me. Why do you end 3rd and start Hunt? It wasn't until this historian brought to my attention what had happened. And my wife talked about it often because she was born right across the railroad track and lived all her life here. And she would always say, when we were growing up, we couldn't go past Florida Street. We were told as kids, don't go past Florida Street. And that was a dividing line where blacks lived on Florida. So here's what the historian says to why 3rd ends and becomes Hunt. Because it was known as Colored Town, west of Florida. That's where blacks live. On the other side of Florida is where Caucasians live. And the Caucasians didn't want anybody to think that they lived in Colored Town. So they didn't want an address that had 3rd Avenue. So they changed the name of the street to Hunt Avenue. And the Hunt family was one of the slave holders that had occupied that particular area. That's just how this area kind of developed. So it developed in an originally segregated neighborhood after slavery, up until the 60s probably, if not a little bit further than that. But something significant happened in 1954. What was that, you scholars? One of the most historic pieces of landmark Supreme Court decisions in the history of the United States of America. Thank you, sir. Historic Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, where United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation in education by race was unconstitutional, and said with all deliberate speed, all publicly funded school systems in the United States of America were to desegregate. And West Virginia took that seriously. The government at the time moved with all deliberate speed, and they began pretty rapid desegregation in Kanawha County, pretty quickly, and in other parts of the state. But many parts of the state did not desegregate elementary schools because the Caucasians didn't want their children, young children, going to school with blacks, so elementary schools were kept segregated up into the mid-60s in a lot of places, in the case of my little neighborhood. So the desegregation of public schools basically started the decline of the West Side community, particularly the historical black community. During segregation, black people lived in tight-knit neighborhoods where there was a middle class and often an upper middle class that lived very closely to the lower middle class, to the working poor, and to the poor, because housing discrimination forced that to take place. Another incredible community to that, and I have a good friend of mine, you need to bring him in down and talk to you at Marshall, Rick Martin, he sits in the back. He grew up in Huntington, in the Fairfield district, right there, but to where you guys go to school. And you come back away from there was all the black neighborhood. As you walk down through there, you find all these black churches. Huntington was even more segregated than Charleston because almost all black people lived in one area in Huntington. That was true in most places, in most cities in the state. So Brown versus the Board of Education started the dismantling of black communities all over the country, because what desegregation did, it in essence says that African-American institutions in many cases would be eliminated. So the black schools were closed in this neighborhood. My friend, Reverend James Ely, his wife Linda Ely, they're a nonprofit. They own and operate the Paul Lawrence Dunbar Second Avenue Community Center. That was a elementary school that was built in the early 1900s, right there on Second Avenue in the heart of the black community. Where Mary C. Snow West Side Elementary School currently sits, there was Cabell Junior High School. So at the elementary school, at the junior high school right there, and there was an all-black high school that was downtown, the Henry Highland Garnett High School. And so, but when they desegregated schools, basically they closed all the black schools. If they didn't close them, they took the buildings and changed the names on the schools. Because back then, whites said that their children would not go to school with a black person's name on it. And so if they kept the building of a black school, as they did in my hometown, W. Du Bois High School, they took the name off of the school, they renamed it Mount High School because it was a newer building. But desegregation dismantled the black community because the schools were closed. The educators, most of them had to leave and go to other communities to find employment education. The society started to open up, and so the black upper class and middle class, they started to move into other neighborhoods, and that left behind the lower middle class, the working poor, and the poor. And that's what happened to the West Side.